Tonight's lesson is lesson 6.3, simplest form. Our essential question is, how can you write a fraction as an equivalent fraction in simplest form? Please write this essential question down in your notes. Let's look at our first problem. It says Brianna bought an ice cream cake and it was cut into 6 equal pieces. Brianna, Stephanie, and Lily each took 2 pieces of the cake home. Brianna said she and her 2 friends each took 1/3 of the cake home. Is Brianna correct? Well, the first thing I did to help me understand the problem better was I drew a model for it. I drew my cake, and then I cut it into 6 equal pieces by drawing a line down the middle, a vertical line, and then I drew 2 crisscross lines. So I drew my 6 equal pieces. And then it says that each of the girls took 2 pieces home. So I labeled each piece of cake with the first letter of the girls' names. So for Brianna, I put a B, and I'm going to shade in Brianna's part in blue to show that this was her 2 pieces. In Stephanie's part, I put an S, and I'm going to shade in Stephanie's part in green to show that these are Stephanie's 2 pieces. And in Lily's part, I put an L, and I'm going to shade in Lily's part in pink to show that these are Lily's 2 pieces. And now I'm going to look at my problem again to see what it's asking and see if my model helps me this time. It says Brianna said she and her 2 friends each took 1/3 of the cake home. Is Brianna correct? Well, now that I look at my model, all shaded in, I can see that there are 1, 2, 3 colors. And that's representing the 3 girls, 3 parts of the cake for each of the girls. So I have 3 equal parts, and each girl gets 1 portion of those 3 equal parts because Brianna is shaded in 1 color, Stephanie has 1 color, and Lily has 1 color. So now I can see that my model is showing me 1/3, but originally each of the girls had 2/6 of the cake. Well, they still do, but now I'm just showing that 1/3 is an equivalent fraction for 2/6. So these are equivalent fractions. 1/3 is just a simplified fraction for 2/6. So Brianna was correct. Each girl did get 1/3 of the cake. So yes, she was right. Our lesson for today is simplest form. A fraction is in simplest form when you can represent it using as few equal parts of a whole as possible. So if you remember, we saw that our fraction in our first problem was represented in 3 equal parts, but then we had it showing 6 equal parts also. So it was in simplest form when it was showing 3 equal parts. So that's fewer than 6. So I'm going to show you how you can make your fractions in simplest form. A fraction is in simplest form when 1 is the only factor that the numerator and denominator have in common. The parts of the whole cannot be combined into fewer equal-sized parts to show the same fraction. So I want to see if I can simplify 6/10. And to do that, I need to divide the numerator and the denominator by the greatest common factor. Now, if I didn't know if my fraction was in simplest form, I could see, okay, the numerator, I would have to list the factors of 6. So I'm going to list my factors of 6, so I know it's 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. Those are my factors of 6. And now I want to list my factors of 10 because that's my denominator. For 6/10, I have 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. Those are my factors for 6 and my factors for 10. So now I need to see, well, it's in simplest form if the only greatest factor that they have is 1. But I can see that it's not in simplest form as 6/10 because they have a greater factor. They have the same factor 2. and that's their greatest common factor that they have. So I can take my 6/10, and I'm going to divide the numerator and the denominator by 2 because that's their greatest common factor. So 6 divided by 2 and 10 divided by 2. And I'm going to say that 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So now I can say that 6/10 is equivalent to 3/5, and 3/5 is in simplest form because 3 and 5, the only factor that they have in common is the factor 1. So 6/10 is equivalent to 3/5, and 3/5 is in simplest form. Now let's write 8/10 in simplest form. So I'm going to look, my 8 and my 10. I know that the only factor that they share is not just 1. So I know whenever we're talking about simplest form, if it's 1, then we say it's done. If the only factor is 1, then it's done. But I know that 8 and 10 share another factor. So remember, to find a simplest form, you have to divide the numerator and the denominator by the greatest common factor. So I need to list my factors of 8, and I know that they're going to be 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. So those are my factors of 8, and I'm going to list my factors of 10. I know they're going to be 1 and 10 and 2 and 5. So those are my factors of 10 and my factors of 8. So there's the 1, and there is a common factor, but I want the greatest common factor. And I can see that the greatest common factor that these two numbers share together is the number 2. So I'm going to divide my 8/10, and I'm going to divide it by 2. So I'm going to divide my 8 by 2 and my 10 by 2. And 8 divided by 2 is 4. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. So I can say that 8/10 is equivalent to 4/5, and 8/10, the simplest form, is 4/5. Now here's a little trick to know if it's in simplest form. We can look at the 4 and the 5, and 4 and 5 are next to each other. That means that they're consecutive numbers. So they're only 1 away from each other. So we know that when the fractions are 1 away from each other, that they're in simplest form. So 4/5 is in simplest form. I know that the only factor they share together is 1, and when it's 1, it's done. I want you to write the fraction in simplest form in your notes. So we have 6/12, and remember, to write it in simplest form, you have to divide the numerator and denominator by their greatest common factor. So if you want to try it out by yourself, you can pause the video and you can check and see if you got it right by pressing play. Go ahead and try. Okay, so our first step was that we had to list the factors of our numerator and our denominator, and we had to see which ones they had in common, and the biggest one, we needed the greatest common factor. So I'm going to list my factors of 6. Well, I know I can do 1 times 6 to get 6, and I can do 2 times 3 to get 6. So those are my factors of 6. Now I'm going to list my factors of 12. Well, I know 1 times 12 is 12, 2 times 6 is 12, and 3 times 4 is 12. So those are my factors of 12. And now I need to see, well, what factors do they have in common? But I want the greatest common factor. That means I want the biggest one. So yes, they have 1 and 1 in common, but that's not the greatest one. 2, they do have 2 and 2 in common, but I can see that I still have more factors that are in common, so that's not my greatest. They do have 3 and 3, but now I'm seeing that they have 6 and 6, and those are the greatest common factors, the number 6. So that's my biggest factor that they have in common. So now I'm going to divide my 6/12 by 6. So I'm going to come up here and do 6 divided by 6 and 12 divided by 6. by the greatest common factor. So 6 divided by 6 is 1, and 12 divided by 6 is 2. So 6/12 is equivalent to 1/2, and 1/2 is in simplest form. Now remember the trick that I showed you? If we know that it's in simplest form, when the numbers are just 1 away from each other. So 1 and 2 are only 1 away from each other, so they're in simplest form. So 6/12 is equivalent to 1/2, and 1/2 is in simplest form. And we found that by dividing the numerator and denominator by the greatest common factor, which was 6. Tell whether the fractions are equivalent. So we're going to use simplest form to help. So first, I want to make sure that 3/6 is in simplest form. Well, I need to list the factors of 3, and then I need to list the factors of 6. So my factors of 3 I know are just 1 and 3, and my factors of 6 are 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. So those are my factors, and now I need to find the greatest common factor. Well, I can see that my greatest common factor is 3. So I'm going to divide my 3/6 by 3/3. Now remember, from our last lesson, I told you that 3/3 is also equivalent to 1 whole. So really, we're just dividing 3/6 by 1, and we're going to get something that equals the same value. So 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. So 3/6 is equivalent to 1/2, and 1/2 is in simplest form. Remember, when it's 1, it's done. So now I need to see if 5/10 is in simplest form. So I'm going to come and list my factors of 5. And my factors of 5 are 1 and 5. That's it. It's a prime number. And now I need to list my factors of 10. We have 1 and 10, and 2 and 5. So now I need to find the greatest common factors. Well, I can see that 5 is the biggest factor that they have in common. So I'm going to divide 5/10 by 5/5, which also equals 1 whole. So 5 divided by 5 is 1, and 10 divided by 5 is 2. So 5/10 is also equal to 1/2. And remember, we know it's in simplest form because the numerator is a 1, and when it's 1, it's done. So now I have that 3/6 is equivalent to 1/2. That's its simplest form. And 5/10 is equivalent to 1/2. So is 1/2 equal to 1/2? Yes, it is. So we can say that 3/6 is equivalent to 5/10. I want you to do this problem in your notes. It says tell whether the fractions are equivalent. You're going to use simplest form to help. So in your notes, I want you to work out this problem. You need to tell me if they're equivalent, and you need to use simplest form to help you. So pause the video, and then when you're ready to go over it, press play. Okay, you should have started out with 9/12. Now I need to list the factors of 9 and the factors of 12 and see which ones they have in common that are the greatest. So the factors of 9 are 1 and 9 and 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. My factors of 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. Now, I can see that my greatest common factor of 9 and 12 is the number 3. So I'm going to divide my 9/12 divided by 3/3. 9 divided by 3 is 3, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. So 9/12 is equivalent to 3/4, and that's it. 3/4 is the simplest form of 9/12. Now I need to look at my 1/3. Well, now remember my trick? If there's a 1 in the numerator, then it's done. So there is a 1 in the numerator of 1/3. So 1/3 is already in simplest form. It's done. We don't have to do anything to it. So I have 3/4 and 1/3. Are those fractions equal? No, they are not. So I should have put an equal sign with a slash through it. They are not equivalent. Your homework for tonight is number 1, 8 of 12 students had hot lunch. So 8 out of 12 students. In simplest form, what fraction of the students bought hot lunch? So you need to look at each choice and you need to see whether they are 8/12 in simplest form. Number 2 says, is this fraction in simplest form? 5/6. Now you need to assess yourself after you get done with the homework. Are you a novice, an apprentice, practitioner, or an expert? Now remember, if you are a novice or apprentice, you need to watch the video again for a better understanding. Work on these problems for homework and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.